Welcome to the Productivity Podcast. This is the first in a mini-series with our friends at InMoment, and today delighted to be joined by Derek Eccleston, who's a customer experience consultant at InMoment. Hi, Derek.
Hi, Simon.
How are you?
Very good, thanks.
Good. So, number one of the mini-series, and today I'm excited about this one. I think this is going to be really interesting. This one is around customer experience and brand promise. We're all a nation of shoppers. It's been a bit difficult in the last couple of months, but I think there's going to be some really interesting insight and probably tips and tricks for hopefully some of those retailers that are listening and other organisations to help them align. So before we jump into the detail, Derek, it'd be good to just understand a little bit more about you. So what you do at InMoment and how you arrived there.
Yeah, sure. So CX consultant at InMoment, working on many of our large global programs around the world in multiple sectors. Before here, I was a co-owner of eDigital Research, which we scaled organically and successfully sold out to private equity. So I did 8 years there. And for the past 3.5 years, I've been at InMoment. Prior to that, client side, both here and abroad, and before that, MBA. So that's me.
Good. So you've got good credentials in this industry. So we're confident what we're talking about today. And I know you've got some good reference statistics to share with us. Jumping into the detail then, we're going to talk about customer experience, brand promise. But I think in the pre-chat that we did, it's kind of interlinked. So at the top level, I think there's successful businesses that are aligned with their customer expectation and brand promise. So I think there's a definite link between those businesses that are successful and the way they align their customer expectations and how that links to the brand promise. And I know you've got some examples of good behaviours and bad behaviours in that. But let's just start with your thoughts on those kind of three key points. So successful businesses, as a statement, have clear brand promise, which is aligned to their customer expectation.
Yes, absolutely, Simon. This is something we've been looking at in some detail with some of the client programs we run. We're always looking to connect the CX outcomes to business outcomes and establish that linkage, because that's how we get traction for the programs that we run, and that's how they get invested in, and we're successful and the clients are successful. So it's something that we're very passionate about and that we need to deliver with our client partners. And understanding success is at the heart of that endeavor. And as you alluded to, Simon, clearly delivering great customer experiences is a mantra for us and our client partners. But then understanding how that plays through into business success, you need to factor in the brand promise, which I'll come back to in a second, because that is an integral part of these connections. So in essence, what we're seeing is that brand promises need to be absolutely clear and distinct and authentic and believable in the marketplace. And the clients that we work with that are successful clearly have that in place. The second element is the customer experience needs to be delivered in line with that brand promise. And the minute that it's not, that's where we see failure happening. That's where we see CX scores plummeting. And that's where we see churn and upsell and all those business metrics falling as well. So to take an example, supermarket sector in the UK is something I've been working in for many years. I've worked with most of the brands at some point or another, and certainly at InMoment, we're privileged to have a bunch of them as clients right now. So we have a lot of data to look at in regard to the UK supermarket sector. So just a first quick look at market share up to the pre-COVID period, and then just rowing back 2 years and seeing how that's moved. Now, this is not like for like, this is just Kantar data, but I think it is indicative of the movements that we're seeing in the sector. So in short, we've got Tesco down 0.8, Sainsbury's down 0.5, Aldi up 0.9, Lidl up 0.8, Waitrose level. Now, the brand promises, as we all know, are very distinct and very different. Price, obviously, for Aldi and Lidl, quality for Waitrose, range Tesco and Sainsbury's service, we could have an argument about that, but let's not go into that. So essentially, we've got very different brand promises. So that's the first point.
In that brand promise piece, can you have a mixture of those, or is it always better to be clear on just one kind of shining beacon that you're really good at?
Well, that's an interesting point. And clearly, job number one in the road to success is about identifying your target customer, understanding what their priorities are. And I would argue, and I've seen this in lots of the modeling work we've done, all of the things I mentioned matter enormously to customers, just in slightly different weights depending on the customer profile. So everybody wants, a good price proposition, everybody wants quality, everybody wants service, and everybody wants range. But the point is, different clusters of customers, different segments will attach slightly different weights to those. So the first job is clearly to understand your customer and what weight they attach to each of these important aspects of the experience, and then also look at the market landscape and identify where there might be a gap where one of these particular value propositions could be an opportunity because it's not effectively covered by the others. So that's obviously a really important part of this. But I would argue that the reason that Aldi and Lidl have grown at the expense of Tesco and Sainsbury's over the last 2 years pre-COVID is not just because price has become more important to the customer, albeit we were in what some people describe as an austerity period. If that were the case, then Waitrose would have gone backwards as well, and they haven't. They've actually maintained 5% market share, according to Kantar. So I would argue that the reason that Aldi and Lidl have gained ground and Tesco and Sainsbury's have slipped back is more about how successful they are at consistently delivering the brand promise. And that's the area that we're finding in our modeling is a key dimension of success. And I think that's what's brought us to this podcast today, to explore that a little bit and see how that works out there in the marketplace.
So if we take the Aldi and Lidl example, my perception of having shopped there is their brand promise is price-led. I think quality to a degree has crept in, so people now know that their own brand or the kind of unbranded things that they sell have a good quality proposition about them. But the trade-off is potentially you're going to have to queue at the checkouts. So there may be less people on the checkouts. There may be a longer queue. And in fairness, they're getting better at that. But it's not a disappointment because I go in expecting that, because actually what I'm buying is a basket of goods which is 10, 15, 20% cheaper than maybe one of the other supermarkets we've talked about. So is that the right interpretation of a brand promise?
That's exactly it, Simon. And the queue example is a really good one. Without giving too much away from the client programs we run, we do pick up and discuss with our supermarket clients feedback around queues, and we find quite low tolerance actually in terms of the Tesco data for customers encountering queues, and Tesco works really hard to make sure that doesn't happen. It's the same with M&S, another of our clients. Queue management is important to the brand. It's important to their customers, and they work very hard to make that part of the experience as effective as possible. But the point is, which I think you're alluding to, is it's about the expectation. And this is the crucial point. It's not necessarily about being the best, whatever the best means. It's about leveling with the public and then executing that perfectly every time. And so what you'll find is in Aldi and Lidl, and we work with both of those across Europe, when you go in there, if you encounter a queue, there will be more tolerance because the expectation setting around queue is different to what it is for a Marks and Spencer or a Tesco.
And clearly there's an on-cost in terms of if the expectation of queuing is zero, as in I walk through, and that's a manned checkout, then there's an additional on cost to that organisation to make sure there's, always somebody sat on an empty checkout, and that typically then gets passed back to the customer. So it's a difficult cycle to satisfy, I suspect, which is back to your point of you've got to be really clear on what your brand promise is and then align to that. So if I've worked in organisations in the late 90s where the brand promise was never more than 3 in a queue, and that was quite well publicised, but actually you just ended up with instant dissatisfaction because a customer would walk in, look to the right of the checkout bank, and there'd be 4 people in every queue because we couldn't afford to man the checkouts to the capacity that we needed to get 3 people in a queue.
Yes, absolutely. And Aldi and Lidl have been really smart about this. The customer understands that they're getting a good price. That's the perception. They understand that there's a trade-off and that the store will be a little bit smaller and the service won't be quite as at the level of some others, and the queuing situation may be a little more onerous for them. But they get that because it's all wrapped up in the whole proposition, and they'll take that if they're going to save money.
And the trade-off again might be that instead of having 10 choices of baked beans, there's 2. So you're acutely aware that the breadth of range, like you say, in terms of the smaller stores is less, but I know that going in. So if I want a specific, herb or spice, that might not be the destination to go. But if I want something that's relatively readily available, I know I should be able to get it there.
Absolutely. I mentioned at the beginning, range is a strength of Tesco and Sainsbury's. Price is the Aldi and Lidl perceived strength. Quality is the Waitrose one. You don't get the range in Waitrose. And that's the first part of the equation. And there will be people for whom quality is the number one. There will be people for whom price is the number one. There will be people for whom range is the number one. And identifying those customers, ensuring that those customers are numerous, live near your stores in the case of the physical environment, that's clearly a critical driver of success. But I think the point here is there's something beyond that. So yes, execute those things and do your best to get to a minimum standard in the parts of the value proposition that maybe you don't own in the marketplace. Yes, that's vitally important. But the extra element in here, which we're seeing in our modeling, explains that connection with business outcomes. There's another element in there, and it's that consistency of delivery and that matching expectation.
Consistency of delivery is really interesting because as a retailer, that is the holy grail. So every large organisation in retail, they strive for consistency, but almost by default are consistently inconsistent. That's a bit of a mouthful to get out, but there's not many. You've mentioned Aldi, Lidl. I think McDonald's probably do a good one outside of retail. You can buy a Big Mac in America, China, Germany, UK, and roughly it tastes the same. You know what you're getting. You know how much you're going to pay for it because the price translates roughly. So that consistency is a fascinating aspect of all of this because I think it is the holy grail for retailers.
It absolutely is. And another great example, to be fair, it does get mentioned a lot, but I make no apology because it's a great story, is TK Maxx and the treasure hunt brand promise. So conventional wisdom would say that if you go into a retail store and the range is a bit haphazard and the organization of the product is slightly disorganized, that they would be killers to brand success, but they're not in the TK Maxx environment. Again, it comes back to this point. It's not necessarily about being the best, however you define best. It's about meeting expectation, setting your stall out, and then delivering against that perfectly every time. And that's what gets you success.
And TK Maxx is a good example. Like I say, it is that element of treasure hunt of, I don't know what I'm going to get this time versus next time. I think if you're a rigid shopper, as in I always want to go in, turn right, and there's the men's jeans, it's a risk because you don't know what you're going to get. So I suspect it appeals to a certain type of shopper or certain type of person that likes the discovery rather than the rigidity of, that's what I know I want. I know I can walk in and get it, because that's not their promise, clearly. But like you say, they're absolutely clear about that, of you're never sure what you're going to find each time, and that's the surprise.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sure they're fully aware that there are customers out there who would never darken their door. And that's the same with any brand. There is an identified customer profile. There is an understanding of what matters most to that target customer in all aspects of their experience. And then there's a dialing up of what matters to the customer and delivering that the best and achieving minimum standards elsewhere. And that's clearly a huge determinant of success. But even if you get all those things right, and I've got some examples coming actually of even when all that's in place, you can still fail if you disappoint the customer and you don't meet the expectation.
So we've got supermarkets as being good examples. We've got TK Maxx. Have you got any other kind of exemplars which are worth mentioning before we move on to the maybe not so great examples?
I'd like to talk about airlines, Simon, if I may.
Yep, fire away.
Okay, another sector I've been working in for many years, fascinating sector. Again, let's talk pre-COVID for a clearer read of enduring dynamics in the marketplace. Now, Ryanair is another fantastic example. They carried more passengers in 2019 than any other airline, 152 million. Now, no one praises Ryanair for their approach to pricing. No one praises them for their baggage allowance policy, their onboard catering, or anything, in fact, about Ryanair. Yet, they carried more passengers in 2019 than any other airline. So, again, it's not about being the best, however you define that. It's about leveling with the public. It's about saying, look, this is what you're going to get. If you don't want it, you're more than welcome to try somebody else. But we're here. We're offering this service. It will get you from A to B. It won't be the most expensive. It will usually be pretty good on price. And it will take you from point to point journeys that actually others can't do anyway, or don't do. They're straight with the public, and people keep flying more and more, up to COVID, obviously, with the airline. So this is another example of, I'm not saying for a minute brands shouldn't strive to be the best that they can be and to delight passengers as much as possible, but actually you can achieve business success through a clear, straight brand promise to the public that people get and understand if you then deliver consistently against that. And again, to the point I made before, this is not saying price is the number one driver, because then you wouldn't see success for Emirates and Etihad, who are premium products, fantastic new planes that they've been able to heavily invest in, new plane models, and they're doing well as well. So again, it's not so much about one particular attribute suddenly being more important in the marketplace and that resonating with more and more customers, although that is clearly playing out here. But there is this other element of consistency and leveling with the public, meeting their expectation. And that is a fascinating dynamic, we think.
What I'm hearing is that you don't necessarily need to be the best. There's no harm in striving to be in your industry or sector. But as long as you're clear about that brand promise, consistently deliver it to a good level, you're putting yourself in a good place to be successful.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's what we're seeing. Again, it is important to get the other elements right. I don't want to downplay the importance of know your customer, understand your customer, understand what matters to them most, be the best at that. so that you resonate with your target customers. I don't want to downplay the importance of those vital elements, but we just thought it would be interesting to add in that extra piece, which sometimes is the missing element when you're doing this linkage analysis and modeling work. And that's why we've discovered this, and we include it in our modeling work. It's this element of consistency, of meeting expectation. And hopefully we'll get time today to talk about what happens when you don't meet expectations.
Okay, well, let's move into that then, because I think this is going to be interesting. So we've talked about some good examples about airlines, supermarkets, etc. So you must have, maybe you don't want to mention the brands particularly, but you must have some examples in retail and outside where it's not aligned and actually people don't get it, if you like, customers don't get it, and I assume that then reflects in results.
You know, we've got lots and lots of clients around the world with lots and lots of programs in lots and lots of sectors. I'm going to spare my clients' blushes here and not share any stories that we've picked up where we have spotted this dynamic at play. We've spotted the brand promise looks fine. There's lots of customers that resonates with, but we're seeing a falling off of scores. And as ever, we always try and connect that through to how's that playing out in terms of sales volumes and so on, and other business metrics. But the stories I can share are pretty public domain. So let's just get into those. So British Airways in January 2017, they introduced buy on board in short haul economy. Now, again, this is public domain. It was all over Flyer Talk and social media. But the point is, there was a negative response to that. And the reason there was a negative response is that BA had basically broken the brand promise, which was, we are a full service airline. And the expectation from a full service airline wasn't to have to pay for food and beverages on board in short haul. And that's why there was a negative response. Now, roll that forward, and now the BA executes M&S on board really well. The range and the proposition has been developed, and the way they deliver it is consistent with British style. They've got some BA personality into the proposition, and there's a lot more tolerance and acceptance around that, which is a wonderful thing. But you know, I think it is public domain that when it was first launched, it was out of kilter with the brand promise, and that's why there was a negative response.
Yeah, it's interesting, is it? Such a small thing can have such a material impact on the customers with the right, I assume, with the right intentions.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's ferocious in airlines. The top end ones with enormous pockets, the ability to invest in new planes and so on, and then you've got the value carriers, and then you've got the full service airlines carving out their space in the middle of this. So it is tough. There's a lot of pressure on cost and so on. And it was a logical response that BA took to this. And thankfully now the way they execute M&S on board is pretty good.
Good. And other examples? You got anything else that's in the public domain we can share?
The Ratner story. So one for our older listeners, Simon. In 1991, there's a chap called Gerald Ratner who did a famous, or infamous, should I say, speech whereby he described one of his product lines as, quote, crap. And another one, he said it was about the price of an M&S prawn sandwich, but wouldn't last as long. Now, this guy was a retailer of jewellery in the high street. It was a value brand. It was a bit garish, so people kind of knew that the price was low and so on. But still, they didn't expect quality to be as low as Gerald Ratner was describing, albeit in jest in an after-dinner speech. And the results were dramatic, and this has gone down in business folklore. The value of the business dropped 500 million pretty much instantly, and Gerald Ratner lost his job of the business he'd created and built. So this is a great example of a value brand with garish advertising, being straight with the public, of offering a value proposition within the jewelry sector, but still having an expectation of a minimum level of quality, and then to break that promise by actually saying some of this stuff was really low quality. it broke the bond with the customer, and customers fled in their droves.
And that was a world before Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, which would have made it in this day and age be viral in seconds, I suspect.
Absolutely right. Yeah, the impact would have been even more rapid and even more dramatic today.
When consistency scores well in your measures, your customer experience measures, have you got any links or any theories on how that translates back? So if you almost work it backwards, so how that translates back to those organizations where they get a good CX score consistently across the brand. Are there any key indicators in their brand promises or their messaging? And have you got any examples that, again, would be worth sharing?
If I may, I'd just give one more airline example. It's the American Customer Satisfaction Index, and we've got data here from the 1990s through to 2015, which shows Southwest Airlines consistently through every year outscoring in customer satisfaction Delta, American, and United. Now, Delta, American Airlines, and United are full service airlines. So Southwest is a budget carrier. So again, here we can see this dynamic of really one would expect Delta, American Airlines, and United, who deliver a better, more comfortable experience for the passenger, to outscore in customer satisfaction Southwest. So it's fascinating that they don't. And again, it comes back to this point about it's not about being the best. It's about being straight with the public and then executing that consistently. And that's another great example of how this plays out.
Yeah, and again, like I say, consistent themes. So there's a really strong thread coming through all of the good and maybe do differently examples. So in terms of that question on the brands that have a consistently good customer experience score, how do you pin that back to their brand message and identity? And are there any kind of key learnings from that?
Yes, we would work with clients to check in on their premise that what they think is important is what the customer thinks is important. And that's a check-in that needs to happen typically on an annual basis. And you can do that in two ways. In a brand and market-wide tracker, you can look into customer sentiment as that shifts over time and how many customers value price over range and vice versa. And what's the volume of those clusters of people for whom price is the number one driver versus those for whom range is the number one driver, and so on and so forth. So it's very important to track those to make sure that what you're prioritizing is what your customers are prioritizing, and that target group of customers are as numerous as they were last year and will be as numerous next year. So that's a really important aspect of this. And then within CX data, again, we can blend in known customer data with attitudinal data and scores, do the modeling on that again to validate the view that businesses will typically have as to what's important to the customer. So it's very important that you track those because things do change over time. And clearly, we've kind of avoided the COVID subject because that's a podcast or two on its own. Just to mention it briefly here, as we all know, things are changing. Customer sentiment is changing. What's important to people and how that's delivered is changing so rapidly and in so many unknown ways at the moment that it's actually more important than ever that brands understand where the customer is at and then deliver against that consistently.
Again, key themes, really clear in terms of brand promise, customer expectation, brand identity and messaging should drive business success. Now, there's a bit of a contradiction in that, which will be the next part, around unexpected experiences that can be a positive. You've got some examples, I know, which would be good to share in terms of it's a bit counterintuitive about what we've talked about, but if you could share some examples on that in terms of how, if I'm not expecting something, sometimes that can be a positive for the customer.
Having mentioned a few times in this conversation the importance of meeting expectation and being consistent, leveling with the public, and baking that into every day, every interaction, every touch point, every experience. We're now going to talk about the unexpected, which actually can be positive. So we've talked about negative unexpected in terms of Ratner's and the BA buy on board story, but there is a positive unexpected side to customer experience, which is equally fascinating. And an example I would put out there, first of all, is the bargain aisle in Aldi and Lidl. Now, as the markets mature and their footprint expands, you could argue that this is less and less unexpected. Having said that, what's actually in the bargain aisle still surprises and delights customers when they spot something that they weren't expecting to buy, grab it, bring it home, and tell their friends about it. Guess what happened to me? It's a little emotional moment, an uplift in the day, a delightful episode within shopping, which for many is a fairly mundane experience. And that is an opportunity to just leave a little mark with the customer, a little warm feeling that they will respond to and will draw them back again. Another great example back in airlines now is Ryanair. So you land on a packed Ryanair flight. You've been possibly stung for money that you weren't expecting to pay with all the extras. And then you land on time, and the pilot celebrates this with a big upbeat punctuality announcement, generally really impressive punctuality stats to share around about Ryanair. Punctuality in Ryanair is not what you would expect to go together, given the brand promise of Ryanair. So when that happens, you're delighted. Contrast that with a BA or an Aer Lingus or an Iberia or one of those airlines, KLM, etc. When they land on time, you're pleased, but you expect that, so the airline doesn't get the same benefit.
The Ryanair one, I'm a skeptical shopper. You see, I'm never sure that they give themselves way too much time in terms of the schedule, that they always land on time. But maybe that's just my curious mind.
Well, Simon, that's a great example of setting an expectation that you know you're going to beat and going beyond meeting expectation and actually exceeding it. So if you're going to set an expectation in supermarkets and you know that realistically there's going to be 3 people on average in a queue, then don't set the expectation that there'll be 3. Set the expectation that there'll be 4.
Yeah, good advice. Good advice. Derek, I think we've covered loads of stuff in this podcast, to say first of a series with you and the team at InMoment. And as I've said a number of times, there's a really, really strong, clear message that comes through to me around that whole business success can really, really be driven or elevated by brand promise, aligned customer expectation, and the consistent delivery. Those are easy things to say, but I think really, really difficult to achieve. Certainly in retail, the consistent delivery, I think that's a real challenge, always has been. Hopefully with tech and other bits of innovation that come through will be easier over the coming years. But clearly all of that revolves around customers. There's 2 or 3 podcasts probably on, do people want to come and visit bricks and mortar and do things in the future, or will it all be driven more online? But again, I think those principles still stand true. So if it's an online experience, there's clear expectations and delivery cycles and the shopping process and the checkout process. So before we close, have you got any final thoughts you'd like to leave with the listeners?
To mention that expectations change. So you mentioned online. Just to quickly call out, Amazon is often held up as the gold standard in terms of convenience. And as they get more and more pervasive, so people's expectations will align with the Amazon experience in terms of online purchase journeys. And so that forces others to shift their delivery to align not just with their brand promise, but with competitor brand promises. So that's another aspect to this.
Brilliant. Appreciate that. So thanks for your time. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts. And we'll catch up soon. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you, Simon.